Hi, everyone. Hi, Erin.
Hi.
People are continuing to filter in.
Great. Welcome, everyone.
Okay, so people are still coming in, but everyone just know that if you have any questions at any point during the webinar, that you should ask them in the Q&A and then we'll answer them either in the verbal Q&A or my PhD advisor, Dr. Erin Hecht, who's here, will help out and answer those as well. I'll give it a little bit longer because it only just turned 8. And I still see the numbers going up, so we'll wait a little bit. Okay, well, I don't see the numbers popping up quite as much, so I guess we'll get started. So we are respectful of everyone's time. I will now find my presentation and then we can get started. Okay. Okay. So here we go. So this webinar is called The Science of German Shepherds. And my name is Sophie Barton, and I'm with the Canine Brains Project of Harvard University. And just a little bit about me before we get into the rest of the webinar. I am a PhD student at Harvard. I'm not going to tell you what year I'm in because it's, yeah, I feel old now. And I work with the Canine Brains Project, which is a research initiative out of the HECT lab. And Erin here is the lab director. And basically, I have earned a master's degree. I'm working towards a PhD. I study dog brains and behavior. I, in my personal life, like dog sports, so I like doing nose work and canicross with my lab mix. And I have always been a dog nerd long before I kind of heard that term. So I was, always reading about different dog breeds and different dogs and trying to see as many dogs in action as possible. And yeah, I just always loved dogs and then ended up researching them. So that's really cool. And I just want to preface all of this by saying I'm not necessarily like a German Shepherd person. Like they're not my breed. I don't have a German Shepherd. And I'm not a breed expert by any means, but I am a scientist who studies and then also happens to love German Shepherds. So that's why I'm talking about this topic. But this will all be from a very scientific perspective and less so from the perspective of, people in the dog world. And this here is just a picture of me conducting a behavioral experiment with Greta, who was a really sweet German Shepherd that I worked with. Okay, so here's the outline for the talk. So first, I'm going to kind of do a brief breed overview. That'll be a little less on the science side, just a bit of history. Then I'll talk about my research that relates to German Shepherds. Then I'll talk a little bit about how nature or genetics influence German Shepherds, and then nurture and how experience influences German Shepherds. Then I'll kind of summarize everything that we've talked about, and then I will do a shameless plug for participating in my research in the Get Involved section. So for breed overview, a little bit of history. So before the industrialization age, Germany had a lot of herding needs because there were a lot of sheep in these rural areas as pictured here. And you kind of see these three dogs here that are remarkably similar looking to what we now consider German Shepherds, although at this time there wasn't this kind of defined breed necessarily, and there were differently local varieties. What these dogs were doing was a type of herding that is very unique and different from what maybe you would see with a Border Collie or an Australian Shepherd or a Corgi or something like that. And it's called tending herding, or sometimes it's called like being a living fence. And basically it means that the dog, through movement and just presence, keeps the sheep in a certain area, often within certain furrows in the road, like shown here, or on roads when they're traveling from place to place. And then also they would double as kind of security guards for the sheep. So they would protect them against things. And so they were somewhat like a livestock guardian dog in that respect as well. And really they were just a versatile farm dog that could do a lot of things. And there were different varieties all over, Germany, and then related breeds all over Europe. And like I said, there were these different varieties, and there wasn't really a unified type yet. So yes, people were breeding dogs that they thought were good dogs to other good dogs, but they weren't really doing it based off of any standard that anyone had. They were just doing it, on a local scale, with the dogs that they had available. So you can see that there's a lot of variation in some of these dogs. Some of them look more shepherd-like than others. I like this one in particular. is a piebald, or not piebald, I think it's a Merle actually, German Shepherd, which is crazy. And then this is a wire hair German Shepherd, and I think those existed until like 1915, as late as 1915 or something. So that's kind of an interesting look that we don't see today. And then this kind of like wavy hair on the back, that was another look that some of them were bred for. But essentially we had all of these different types. They're all doing roughly similar-ish things. And they are not yet a unified breed. And so all of this is all of these pictures are around 1880s, I think, are most of these. And then, of course, anyone who's familiar with the breed, I should have put a picture of him as well, but you would know Max von Stephanitz, and he is kind of the big, father of the breed. And what he did was he kind of picked German Shepherds, or what would be German Shepherds, from the existing population of all these different varieties, and he was going for dogs that had a certain intelligence and kind of utilitarian aptitude, rather than having a very particular look. And so this was one dog that he actually met at a dog show and then bought. And his name is Horand von Grandfarth. I can't really say that. It's a very fancy name, but this was the dog, and he looks kind of, not unlike a German Shepherd in some respects, depending on what lineage you know today and that sort of thing. But this dog was apparently very talented at herding as well as other utilitarian tasks. And this dog kind of, from this dog came a lot of progeny. And, this is really kind of the original German Shepherd, if you're going to call it a breed at this point. And then later on, then we have kind of an urbanization, industrialization kind of thing goes on in Germany, where there's less and less sheep herding. And it's declines by like 80% or more, and people need another use for these dogs, and von Stephanitz was always thinking about this, very early on, that these dogs needed to be versatile and able to do other things as well. And so they kind of fell into police work and military work naturally, because they're very athletic. As we can see here, this dog had just gone up this and is going down. I believe this is like, oh, I don't even know, 9 or 10 feet. And then here we have a dog tracking, and here we have a dog doing apprehension. So the dog is helping this person, is like fighting a suspect. And I suspect all of these pictures were very staged, by the way. And so basically these dogs were kind of doing these roles as well, and more so they were being selected for these roles and less so for kind of the original herding purpose, although some lineages the herding was still kind of kept in there. And that's not to say that these lineages couldn't herd, but it's just that's not what they were being selected for necessarily. And then we kind of move forward. Oh, and I should specify that there's a sport that we'll talk about in this talk called Schutzhund, or IPO, that is kind of a protection dog sport slash evaluation tool for breeding. And the first trial for that was in 1901. So that's kind of when that stuff sort of started to emerge. That was really sculpting the breed. And then in 1929, there's this guy called Morris Frank, who was a blind individual, and he wanted a dog that would help him navigate. And I think he heard about this through like a story like a military story of a dog helping a blind soldier. So he thought, why can't a dog do this in everyday life? So he actually contacted a breeder of German Shepherds in Switzerland and then got in connection with her, and they basically helped him get this dog called Buddy, who is pictured here. And he helped guide Maurice Frank in 1920. I think it's either 1928 or 1929, famously. And then the year after, I think it's 1929, is when the Seeing Eye was founded, which is like the first guide dog school or the oldest guide dog school. And so they used to use German Shepherds a lot. And so German Shepherds were really like the first breed that was being used as a guide dog, at least in the US. I'm not sure about other countries. And then in the present day, the German Shepherd, I'm just going to talk from an American perspective, is the fourth most popular AKC breed. It's still popular as a working breed for a variety of tasks, including those tasks that they were doing early on. So a little bit of herding still exists, but then also primarily we have that police and military work. So there are these dual purpose dogs that are doing scent detection as well as kind of more protection style work. And then you have the IPO or Schutzen dogs that are doing the whole protection dog sport, which we'll talk about more, and so forth. So and then also people are still using them from guide work, some organizations, and they're also often search and rescue dogs, and can do a variety of other tasks as well, service dogs as well. And one thing to kind of note, which may or may not be controversial to people, is that in the breed, it seems like there's this kind of split between working and companion lines, and that's only to be expected with any population. If you have some individuals being selected for more one thing and others more another thing, you might have divergence, and you might have divergence just because they're different populations. And so you can kind of see in this figure that I've pulled off the internet from this website that there are these kind of different physiques, at least, that are associated with the different lines. The working being like dogs that are kind of bred for this police, military, or Schutzen sort of stuff. And then the show that are being bred more for, being show dogs as well as companions. And they have different looks to them. And people say, I'm told, that they have different, personalities, drives, and so forth, which is only to be expected since they're kind of these distinct populations. So yeah, not only is there this working and companion dichotomy, there's also variation with according to like location and where the animal is being bred. But that's not to say that a working dog couldn't be a good conformation dog necessarily, and vice versa. It just is not common, and they're usually distinct things. My research, I'm going to talk about a little bit next, and I will kind of give you a brief overview here. So kind of the whole point of like my PhD, like my thesis, is looking to see how the dog brain is shaped by selective breeding or nature and training or nurture. So I do this by studying working breed dogs because there are individuals that have different experiences. So there are some that end up in working households or working kennels, and there are others that end up as companion dogs in homes. And so you can really pry apart with these dogs, not only that experience difference, but also because there are these different breeds selected for different behaviors, you can look and compare against all these different types to see how selection and genetics is actually changing these dogs. And the breeds that I ended up studying or choosing to study and am currently studying right now are German Shepherds, Labrador Retrievers, Border Collies, and Eurohounds, which are also less commonly known as Alaskan Sprint Racing Sled Dogs. You've probably not seen one unless you're familiar with like the sled dog world. They're kind of not quite a breed, but they are a type that is kind of a hybrid of different breeds. But anyway, um, then for these dogs, how I study them is I study their brains through non-invasive MRI brain imaging, so magnetic resonance imaging. So that's the same sort of MRI that you receive when you go to the hospital, or if you maybe if you broke your ankle, then you might have to have an MRI. So it can image any part of the body, including the brain. And here we have some raw images of the brain. The structural images is what they're called that let you look at the structure. And this is kind of like the middle half of the brain. The eyeballs in this dog are over here, and then the tail is this way. And so that's these dogs that I study. And now I'm just going to pivot to talk about the German Shepherds that I specifically am going to talk about here, which are protection and guide German Shepherds. Specifically, the protection ones I study are Schutzen dogs or IPO sometimes as well. And then we also have guide dogs who are from an organization called Fidelco. And the main thing about these dogs that I want to get across is that they are under different selective pressures, and we don't know if this has made them different or not from one another. We do know that they have to respond differently in different situations. For instance, the protection dog needs to be able to aggressively defend, whereas the guide dog should never show any sort of defensive behavior in any situation. Whereas the guide dog has to make a lot of independent decisions. That is still they still make decisions in Schutzen, but maybe that's a little bit less prominent. And the guide dog has to kind of do a lot of things to kind of stay in pace with the person, and then also react to a lot more environments than the Schutzen dog does, because they're accompanying a person in so many different places. And so there might be differences, there might not be, but they haven't really been studied or compared yet. In fact, a lot of, the science on German Shepherds, even though this breed has been around since, 1900, is kind of a little bit limited. So we'll deal with what we have. But for my research, one more thing before I can tell you my results is I just have to orient you to the brain a little bit. And so this is a silhouette of a German Shepherd head, let's say, and this is a cartoon of where the brain would be. This is a little 3D rendering. The eye would be right here, of course, and right here is the rest of the brain. And so in this model here, which is the same, just gray, not pink, we have these 4 different general regions that I want you to be aware of. So there's the occipital lobe at the back of the head. It's like that in humans as well. Back there is for vision mostly. And that is, going to be, highly involved in some of these tasks I'm going to talk about. Then we have sensory motor regions up here. And the sensory motor regions are really going to help control movement, as well as integrate sensory information that's relevant to the movement and planning of movement and that sort of thing. Then we have the olfactory bulb that's at the front here, and at the front here, that is the first part of the brain that processes olfactory or scent information from the world. And it's, involved in early odor discrimination and things like that. So that's an important region here to remember. And then we have the temporal lobe, which is on the side of the head. The temporal lobe is very auditory, famously. This is where like the primary auditory cortex is. If you speak neuroscience, but if you don't, that's basically the area of the brain that of the cortex that is the first place to receive information about the senses from lower down brain regions. And so the temporal lobe also has a lot of multisensory capabilities as well. And so it also is highly involved in vision and taking in vision information from the occipital lobe, which we'll talk about as well. Okay, so that's all the brain anatomy you need to know for this. So now I'm going to show some pretty graphs, or at least I think they're pretty. They might look complicated, but I promise the longer you look at them, the more they make sense, and I'll talk you through them, so it'll be fine. This is the protection German Shepherd brain network, and this is the average of many individuals. And essentially, what we're looking at here are all of the connections in the brain, or at least the top 20% of those connections. And so they're pretty much limited to these main regions, which I'm going to talk about here. And these circles are, you can think of them as individual brain regions. So like little parts of the brain that do specific things. And then these lines in between them are the connections. So how those little parts of the brain are communicating with each other. So if they're connected, they can communicate more easily. If they're not connected, they have to go through a circuitous route to talk to each other, and it's less likely to happen. Basically, the occipital lobe in purple here is back here, and it has a lot of different little nodes. And then out here is on this orange thing, this is called brain region called the caudate that is relevant in reward. So it's a little bit segregated from here. So what I should also first say is that this graph is a force-directed graph. And what that means is that essentially connected nodes cluster together. So these nodes are the brain regions, the circles, they cluster together. And then if they're highly connected, and then if they're distantly connected, they're far away from each other on the graph. So like for instance, this light blue sensory motor area is very not connected to these purple occipital lobe nodes over here because it's very far away. And so this kind of indicates path length as well, so how far the signal has to travel. And so you can see that, and then here's the olfactory bulb, which is close to the caudate. And then we have a couple of occipital regions that are actually clustering more with the temporal lobe. Like I said, that there's that communication there. And then they might send some information to the sensory motor areas, which are over here. And so this will kind of all make more sense once I compare it to another one, which is the guide dog or guide German Shepherd brain network. And for this network, you can see that already it's much more closely integrated. Things are closer together and they're less far apart. So more these little kind of colored regions are communicating more with each other. And you can see that the kind of orientation of some of these are kind of different. But we see kind of generally the same structure, which would make sense because we're looking at kind of the strongest connections, and those are probably the ones that are a little bit more stable in the brain. And you can see here that, yep, they kind of look similar, but they are more integrated with all of these kind of little connections. And then for a comparison, And for reasons I'll explain later, I'm just going to compare to both of those to a non-working dog brain. But this is not a non-working German Shepherd. This is the average, a bunch of different dog breeds that are working dog breeds, modern working dog breeds, but they're not they're not all German Shepherds. So with that caveat, you can see again that there is much more distance between some of these regions here. And then in fact, in these non-working dogs, and by the way, these are all dogs from working lines, but are companions. You can see that their sensory motor areas are much further out and actually less integrated with the temporal. And then also there's this like slightly different color green here that I didn't mark, but this is the frontal cortex. This is the frontal cortex here, which actually is relevant in the non-working dog brain, but not in the German or not in the German Shepherd protection dogs and German Shepherd guide dogs. But anyway, we kind of have, more of this spacing out. And this kind of looks like an intermediate between the other two. So to kind of summarize all of that and look at them all at once, you can see that the longest connection lengths are with the protection German Shepherd, and this is determined not just visually, but through graph statistics. So we know that the longest connections are in these protection German Shepherds, which means that there is less communication between the distinct types of regions, which means that the brain has more specialized circuits that don't really communicate with others as much. Whereas with the guide German Shepherds, it's more integrated. The path lengths are shorter, or the connection lengths, and the types of regions are more integrated. And then for the non-working, it's kind of intermediate, where it's a little bit longer and it's moderately integrated. So that's kind of like these broad kind of statistics and graph metrics that I've looked at in these dogs. But there's more, and to talk about that, I just need to briefly talk about airports, which seems like a really weird swerve, but it'll make sense. So this is kind of related because of networks. So networks are networks no matter what medium they're in, like brains or airport travel or something like that. So here I just want to talk about the concept of what a hub is. So all of these are nodes. So like in the previous examples, they were brain regions, but here they're airports in different cities. And the size of them in this particular graph means how important they are, and how important they are means how many connections they have. And so how important they are, it kind of relates to like if they were removed from the network, what would happen. So you can imagine that if you live in a small town and then all of a sudden there is no let's say you're in the Midwest and there's no Chicago airport, it's not running for whatever reason, it would be really hard to get to somewhere distant like Dubai. But if it's working, then you have no problem. And so these kind of big hubs have a really big impact on the entire network structure, and they're disproportionately important. And so that's why, those airports are the biggest and, probably have the most funding and whatnot. So the brain version of this is kind of what region has the most connections and is the most important in the network. And here we're looking at guide German Shepherds and a region called the ectosylvian fissure, which is actually this kind of crease, this tissue within the crease of this sulcus here, which is like a valley in the brain. The gyri are the hills. And with this, we see that this region is really important in the network, has a lot of connections, and is a top hub. So it's in the top 20% of hubs or nodes in the network that receive information. So it's really important. And when I found this, I was like, okay, what could this be related to? And I found this study. This was in an fMRI study where they looked at dogs' brains while they looked at images of people, either just people's faces on a video screen or people's faces in real life. And it turns out versus objects and other things. And it turns out that the dog's ectosylvian fissure, it functionally activates, which means more blood flow goes to that region to support activity when the dog views faces versus objects. And then in particular, it is more active when dogs view real faces versus video faces. So this has to do with something to do with visual processing and social processing. And so maybe in these guide dogs, this has to do with how they are responding to cues from the handlers and trainers. So it could be that they just have to be really in tune with the person that they're working with. And particularly in tune with the person's emotions, maybe. But then with the protection German Shepherds, they had another region that was its own distinct hub that wasn't in the guide dogs. And this is retrosplenial cortex, which is back here. So this is like the rear of the brain. This is the cerebellum, and this is the rear of the brain. And this region is not well studied in dogs, to my knowledge, but it is well studied in like rodents and primates and humans, and it's known to be involved in kind of your own sort of internal sense of direction, and kind of is involved in kind of spatial navigation and like contextual processing, and then integrating memories with where the body is in space currently. And so I think that this might be related to kind of the tasks that Schutzhund dogs are actually performing when they are competing or when they're training. So one thing is they have to kind of, during the protection phase, they have to search for a threat. So they have to kind of move through these blinds in a certain way, and that they've done this before, so it probably activates some memory and some spatial awareness. Then there's also the fact that they oftentimes, for most of it, have to stay kind of really close heeling to the person. So that might have to do with them coordinating where they are in space with the person that they're working with as well. And, there are probably a bunch of other explanations that people who actually do the sport would have for this, and I'd be, happy to hear them. But yeah, this region seems to be very highly connected in these dogs, but not the guide dogs. All right, so now I am going to shift to nurture, or sorry, this should be nature. Yeah, so now we're going to talk about nature. Outside of my research, kind of what else is there out there on German Shepherds? I kind of went through the literature and picked out what I thought would be kind of interesting and most relevant to all of you, who I assume are not scientists and who want to know more about the breed and things that are relevant to helping you, breed and care for German Shepherds and things like that. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the concept of heritability. So there's the statement here that says some behaviors are heritable. And what does that mean? Basically, it means how much variation in a trait across dogs comes from genes versus the environment. So you can kind of think of it like a cookie recipe, or cookies. If you're making cookies and the variation in how good it is really depends on the recipe, then you could say that that is like highly heritable. The cookie goodness is highly heritable. But then if it really depends on the particular like settings of your own oven and the just random environment that the cookie is made in, then it's less heritable how good the cookie is, and it's more to do with the environment. So that's a really bad analogy just to say that this is kind of how driven by genes is this particular trait across the population. And so here not we, but the people here, Friedrich et al., we're looking at two populations of German Shepherds that they kind of combined, which I kind of take issue with, but it's still a really good study. So they were UK companion German Shepherds as well as Swedish working German Shepherds. The Swedish working German Shepherds, I believe, were all military dogs. And basically, they collected pedigree and genomic data on the dog. So the genome or genomic data just means all of the genes in the dog. They have all of those mapped. And then the pedigree, of course, is just kind of the mapping out of their ancestors, as far as people know, through family trees and whatnot. And then also they had the dogs or the people fill out something called the CBARC survey, which I'm not going to remember the acronym's, full name for right now, but is developed by James Serpell out of UPenn. And it measures things like you see in the graph here. And basically, they were able to use this pedigree and genomic data to see what behaviors were more heritable or seemed to be driven more by genes because, they pop up more in family lineages that had those traits, let's say. Or are they kind of is there less evidence for that and it's more environment? And so you can say that some of these, they didn't find much evidence for genetic contributions like separation anxiety. But they did for some things like human-directed playfulness. So the top three I have in orange here. And human-directed playfulness is interesting because especially with working dogs, they're rewarded most often with toys, and so they have to have intense toy drive. So that might be why, or not why, but that might be really interesting and relevant because it seems like that's a very heritable trait, at least with the caveat, at least in these populations. And so with genetics and environment sort of stuff, it always depends on the environment as well. Ultimately, you have to know, or not on the environment, on the population. So it might not be exactly the same in, say, American German Shepherds, but it's not a bad, guess at least. And so for chasing and non-social fear, you also had a lot of heritability. And then, so this, these levels 0.23, you can kind of think of not as a percentage necessarily, but just kind of, 1 would be completely heritable and 0 would be not heritable. So it's what people would say is moderately heritable. Something like 0.7 would be like extremely, extremely heritable by like, heritability standards and stuff. And then you have these other behaviors that are a little bit less heritable in these populations as well. And a similar sort of analysis, just using pedigree data, looked at this in German Shepherds in Switzerland, not Swiss white German Shepherds, but German Shepherds bred in Switzerland. And the cool thing about these dogs that were associated with this club is that there's this breed club test that's been going on for a really long time that's standardized. And so the researchers were able to get that data as well as the pedigree data and look to see whether these aspects of this breed club test were heritable in this population. And a lot of these behaviors or traits here are relevant to protection dog work and like dual purpose dog work and things like that. So the top three again are orange. Nerve stability is something that is quite heritable in this population. And nerve stability is kind of like how level-headed and cool-minded is the dog. Can the dog make decisions under pressure, has resilience, things like that. Self-confidence is self-explanatory, is like the dog, comfortable, calm, at ease when there's no threat. Reaction to gunfire, you want less of one. And so that's good that that is somewhat heritable. But some of these other things that are desirable are not so much, especially sharpness, was not very heritable, compared to the others at least. And then I should also say that in this study, the authors later thought that maybe nerve stability and self-confidence were kind of measuring the same thing. But and because these behaviors highly correlated. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. But either way, both of those things or that one thing is pretty heritable. And so basically, what they did with the data was they calculated this thing called relative breeding value, which is kind of a percentile ranking against the average of how likely a dog is to pass on a desirable trait. And so here you can see that in self-confidence, which was pretty heritable, if you go back in time to 1976, dogs basically dogs were not scoring as highly on this, and then it was kind of less more dispersed throughout the population, and then over time you have this improvement. Whereas with sharpness, which kind of started higher to begin with, you don't really have much change, which might be related to this lack of heritability that they calculated, although this is just one study and this is just one population. And they didn't look at the genetics themselves. So I can't say for certain, if this is going to be exactly the truth, but really this is kind of pointing to the idea that a lot of the working traits that are desirable in Schutzhund dogs and those sorts of dogs are actually heritable, which is a good thing for breeding programs. Also, selective breeding can not only change heritable traits like more self-confidence, but it can also decrease, rates of hip dysplasia. Basically, there are these, hip tests that, most people know about that you can do on German Shepherds because they're a breed that is prone to a problem called hip dysplasia. And you can see that, back in 1980, they weren't really screening for it, or they were just starting to maybe, but it wasn't really a thing. And the estimating breeding value was basically lower. So up here is higher, it's basically you want it to be lower. And it was higher up here, but then over time it's kind of decreased in the German Shepherd, which is green here. The Golden Retriever is that pinkish color, and then the Lab has kind of gotten better and then a little bit worse. And then you kind of see here that what you would expect should also be true is the case for German Shepherds, which is the proportion of excellent scores on the hips has been increasing over time, which is probably due to selective breeding away from hip problems. So that's really cool. But this has been most successful, it seems like, in Labrador Retrievers. And I'm not sure why that is. And then it seems like there's maybe even a plateau or a little dip in Golden Retrievers at some point. But this is all just to say, and these are American German Shepherds. But all of this is to say that, heritable traits can be changed. And, particularly if they're pretty heritable, like genetic trends in hips. Okay, so now we're going to shift to nurture. So the environment still matters, and especially in early development. And I thought one study that's really short and sweet study that I thought would be really cool to show is this one by Chalupkova et al. That was in PLOS One, the journal PLOS One. And basically they had, I believe, police dogs or military dogs, one or the two. And they wanted to know, does early noise exposure reduce noise sensitivity? So there's kind of this idea that if you expose young puppies to certain stimuli, like, there's like this idea of like tactile stimulation and stuff, that you might actually prepare the dog more for expecting those sorts of things in the environment when they're older, and then they're less scary and so forth. And so they wanted to test this principle with these dogs. So they had them listen to the radio 3 times a day for, a certain amount of time at 80 decibels. And they also did it when they were feeding. So hopefully they would start to associate it with a positive experience. And then they also had a control group that didn't. And why there's a shovel here is because in this particular uh, paradigm, they measured the noise sensitivity response with a shovel. So they would hit a shovel on like a metal grate or something. It was like a manhole cover, and they would just hit it a couple of times, and then they had, a coding system for measuring the dog's responses. And you can see that the treatment group had much higher, clearly higher mean scores on this scale that they made. So they were clearly responding better, and like they were less afraid of the noises that they were hearing. And this is very relevant because working dogs in some contexts have to hear really loud, sudden sounds. So this is I think this is a cool study that, should, definitely be replicated and also, explored further and, from a practical standpoint. Um, then also there's this old study that is pretty obscure, but I think is so cool. I've not seen a lot like this since, where Slaver and Rosa in 1997, they wanted to see if puppies would learn more easily, if puppies would learn a task if they watched their mother perform it for a bunch of times. So basically, could they observationally learn, or could they, not even doing the activity themselves, learn how to do the activity by watching their mother do it? And so how they kind of designed this study, and it was very clever, was they had 4 groups. They had 2 groups with a naive mother. So the mother had never been trained, but she was from the same working lines. And at 6 weeks, these puppies were separated from her. Nowadays, a lot of people wouldn't like to do that. Not saying that's a good thing, but they were separated at 6 weeks. And then another group was separated from her at 12 weeks. Then we have 2 other groups with a trained mother who knows how to do this task. We had ones that were basically at 6 weeks, they were separated from her. And so they never got to see her train. But between 6 weeks to 12 weeks, they had the puppies watch the mother train. And so at 12 weeks, they separated the puppies and tested them. And so a 5 here on this scale is a passing score. Basically, this dog can detect narcotics as a police dog. And a 0 is the dog can't do it at all. And the 9 is the dog is amazing at it. And you can see here that basically these naive puppies, some of them naturally actually managed to do it, but very many of them did horribly because they'd never been taught it. And then at 12 weeks, these dogs maybe did slightly better, but not really. And then the trained mother, it's the same thing. A couple more successful, but not really. But so it seems like being with a mother might help a little bit. But what really ups the scores and puts them in that upper half is when they are allowed to watch the mother work between 6 to 12 weeks. And so those dogs were performing really well, and some of them were performing, as well as you could possibly do. And that's with them never being trained by a person, only through watching their mother. So observational learning should definitely be studied more in dogs. But this is kind of a lesson to take home if you're a breeder, maybe not learning tasks necessarily, but if the mother is fearful towards something, you don't really want that to happen in the context of her puppies, maybe. Um, then also handler experience influences behavior quite a bit. Or influences dog behavior. And so these are the CBARC scores that I was talking about earlier, but these are in German Shepherd guide dogs. And the scores on these are basically what was their mean score on this scale for dog-directed fear or non-social fear. And then the particular bar is whether or not the person who raised them had ever raised a puppy before. If they hadn't, it was a black, and then, gradation up to light gray with 5 or more. And so you can clearly see that in these groups, but especially touch sensitivity and dog-directed fear, the handlers who had no experience had dogs that had higher scores for these problem behaviors. Maybe there's a trend towards that with non-social fear, but I don't think it was significant. But then over here, with dog-directed aggression, there's a clear effect here that if you had never dealt with dogs before, or at least guide dogs before, then maybe it's harder to raise a dog that is less dog-directed aggression, and so forth. So this is kind of all to say that definitely how your dog is also going to depend on how you are as a person and how you are as a handler or trainer or parent or whatever you call yourself with respect to your dog. And just kind of one last thing is, it's not just early development, also, adult, the inner state of the dog as an adult can be changed by experience, and particularly by training. So here were German Shepherds that were either working, competing, or companion, with the presumption that the competing dogs were kind of in the most intense situations for the most part. And so interestingly, they looked at hair cortisol. So cortisol is like the famous stress hormone. And you can actually measure it in hair to see on average over a long period of time how stressed the individual has been from like a physiological standpoint, like how much stress is there in the body. And you can see that it's the highest in the dotted line, which is the competing dogs, no matter what season it is, but especially so in January. Whereas for the working dogs, they're actually less. They have less cortisol in January than companion dogs, a little more in May, and then a pretty much more in September. So it would make sense that they're experiencing more stress. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's like something called like Yerkes-Dodson law, where you kind of want an optimal amount of stress for performance. So if you're like too relaxed, like if you're taking a test and you're too relaxed, you're going to do terribly. But if you're too stressed, you're going to do horribly. You kind of have to be in the middle. And so it may or may not be a bad thing. We don't kind of know what the right range is for these dogs, for welfare. So this has nothing to do with welfare, but just kind of the stress levels. And we see that it's highest in January. And this might be because this study took place in Sweden. And in Sweden, it gets really cold and it's hard to train during the winter. And the dogs are more cooped up. And so maybe these competing dogs that are highly selected for training constantly are not doing well, maybe when it is impossible to train. Whereas the companion dogs are less affected by this because their life is normally, not that active or crazy. And so that's the story there. But then there was another study that I found that was kind of complementary, looking at Schutzhund in particular. So again, something like the competing dogs. So these are two different levels of protection dog competition. And one of the 3 is higher than the 0. And they wanted to see if the level of cortisol was different in the dogs during rest and then also during training. And it turns out that the ones that were competing at the higher level were more stressed. So that's one thing to keep in mind, kind of as, if you're competing in dog sports or dog work, is that, even though your dog, might be well acclimated to performing work, you still might expect their body to be a bit more stressed when you're asking more of them or harder things of them. So kind of keep that in mind. So kind of a summary. What does science say about German Shepherds? Well, basically what I've said is that selective breeding and training impact how a German Shepherd's brain is wired, and we're just starting to explore that. So hopefully more findings to come soon. Then also, several important German Shepherd traits are moderately heritable. So for instance, like self-confidence and like hip conformation. And so those things should be responsive to artificial selection. So, selection can have a positive effect if you go in the right direction and you don't probably go too far. And then also early experiences, handler expertise, and training practices. So all sorts of experience sort of things influence German Shepherd behavior as well as their physiology, their hormones. And German Shepherds are just broadly an excellent model for studying how genes and environment shape the brain and its behavior. So, I think that more people should study German Shepherds. I think that they're really useful dogs, not just as working dogs, but also as ways for us to learn more about the world from a scientific perspective. So now just a shameless plug to get involved. So I run something called the Working Dog Breed Study. And these are the questions that I'm really interested in relating to German Shepherds with regards to the study. So which parts of the brain are involved in German Shepherd working behaviors? So, what, is the amygdala involved, or, is the cortex involved, or, what's actually important for the dog to perform the task? And then how does that brain anatomy relate to working performance? So how does variation in it predict performance? So can we look at brains and predict how well a dog performs in the real world? And also, how is German Shepherd brain anatomy different from that of other breeds that have been selected for different things? And then which genes are associated with brain anatomy, behavior, and/or working performance? So we have collaborators, including someone called Dr. Anna Kukakova, who is helping us to analyze that as well. And here is a picture of the first control German Shepherd for the study, Remy. So I should specify that we are accepting both working and non-working or companion dogs into this study. And so Remy was from working lines, but is a companion dog. But we're open to, any sorts of working and companion or any sorts of companion dogs. And for working dogs at the moment, we're mostly interested in protection dogs, but if you have another type of dog and you're really interested, you can still sign up in the pre-registration form. And we never know, if we have enough signups, we might be able to add another study group. And so some perks of participation include you will get to have images of your dog's brain, which is pretty cool, and there'll be higher resolution images than you'll get from like a vet MRI scan. So that's really exciting. So here's like a brain that's kind of isolated from the rest of the skull. From Trinity here, this is Trinity's brain. And then here's a 3D model of Trinity's brain as well. You'll learn about your dog's brain, so we'll be able to tell you some things about your dog, which you would kind of never find out otherwise. So it's really a unique opportunity. It might, explain some things, and, all pretty cool. And then, also the added benefit of just seeing if your dog has a brain, which, people tell me all the time their dogs don't. And then you'll help improve our understanding of German Shepherds, so you'll really help the breed. You'll also help advance working dog breeding and training practices, because we're hoping that this information will be useful for that sort of thing. It's a good excuse to visit Harvard, which is really beautiful in the fall. And, the campus is really nice. And Cambridge is nice. And we have underground parking that's free, so you don't have to worry about parking in Cambridge, because I know a lot of people are afraid of that. And then also you can just help a poor grad student finish her PhD if you participate. So, really my success depends on people participating. So yeah, please do. And So to learn more and sign up, here is a QR code, which will take you, I think, to the study webpage, or you can just search caninebrains.org. That'll take you to our main page. If you go to MRI studies on there, then you'll see the working dog breed study. We also have a form just on our main page that you can fill out. So, whatever's easiest. So I'll leave that out for like another second or two. Okay, so I'm gonna go on now. So now we're gonna try to do the Q&A section of the talk. So I know Erin's already been responding to a lot of questions. I'm going to see if I can answer some as well. I will answer this one. Okay. So, there's this question here that's, I think I'm in the thing that lets you answer the question. Am I, Erin?
So, Sophie, if you go to the Q&A, there are
Uh-huh.
a few that I have flagged as answer live. If you want, I can read them out for you.
Okay, yeah, sure. That would be great.
Sure. Okay. So Lorian asks if GSD traits began to be cultivated as a proto-breed in the 1880s and standardized in the 1900s, do you think that line breeding has been reinforcing trait selection continuously for something like 40 generations, or is it more fractured? I actually have no idea about this myself.
Yeah, I am not well versed enough in like the breeding practices to kind of know how traits tend to be passed down, whether it's line breeding versus otherwise. But I think that kind of what has allowed the German Shepherd to kind of maintain and then maybe, quote unquote, improve upon traits over time has been kind of the systematic breeding according to temperamental and working standards that has kind of happened in the breed historically in both Europe and in some, groups in the US. So I think that, when you are inbreeding a lot, it is kind of easier to fix traits, that's for sure. But there are a lot of supposed health risks with long, generational patterns of inbreeding. So definitely for health reasons, there might be reasons to kind of break from that sometimes, and then sometimes that might actually bring in a new trait or quality that is actually really beneficial. But that's kind of like a really kind of not very confident answer I'm giving, just kind of the best I can do for that one.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That seems like a reasonable answer to me. Yeah. Sh Shall I keep going with other
Yeah,
live?
yeah.
Okay, cool. So one of the ones that you flagged from Becky was um, what we consider working: SAR, herding, obedience, RH therapy, others.
Yeah. So, like the term working dog is not like set in stone necessarily, and I'm not the be all end all authority on it. But I think that in the working dog literature, like the scientific literature, when people are writing about these, typically they're considering everything you said except I think therapy dogs as working dogs. Because they're performing particular tasks that are kind of active and conscious on the part of the dog, or supposedly conscious. And so that's typically how I would define it based off of how the literature generally does. But, definitely, if we're expecting things of a therapy dog, like being able to be in an environment and be neutral and things like that, then in a way the dog is kind of working as well. So I can understand why people might want to call that working too.
Yeah, that seems reasonable to me too. A clarification question about the stress graph. IPO
Yeah.
0 versus IPO 3, what does that mean?
Oh, yeah. Those are different levels of Schutzhund competition. So IPO 0 is lower than IPO 3, and so that is why so that's like a less difficult kind of they have to do a less difficult thing than the IPO 3 dogs have to do. And so their cortisol levels seem to appropriately be lower because maybe less is being expected of them, versus the IPO 3 dogs are having to do more complex things and they also have more pressure on them. So that might be why they have higher cortisol levels. And then I should also specify that this was hair cortisol over on this graph with the seasons. Over here, this was cortisol measured through poop, actually, which tells you about the level of stress in the past like 24 hours, whereas in the hair cortisol, it's like over the past like 3 to 6 months.
Got it. Okay. So a question about when dogs visit the lab. So how much stress is involved when testing the dogs or when they get an MRI scan, and what does a day look like for them when they visit?
Okay, yeah. So, it depends on what they're doing with us, but I'll speak for my study. For the working dog breed study, we try to kind of make it as low stress as possible. So before dogs ever set foot in our lab, we kind of ask the participants detailed questions about how their dog does in environments that seem vet-like, because it will seem vet-like to the dog. And we take special precautions if a dog might be anxious, and things that would help the dog be a little bit more comfortable in the situation. We also only have vet staff handling the dogs, and we can minimize the number of people present and things like that. Um, we also let the dogs get acclimated in our waiting room before anything happens, and they get to meet everyone, and we're a really friendly team. And conveniently, because some dogs are, a little bit anti-male, we're all female, so it works pretty well. So if you have, a male human aggressive dog, then it's fine. And basically we take all the safety precautions, and dogs are woken up in a very calm manner. They're not nothing crazy is happening, and they get to reunite with their owner pretty soon afterwards. The recovery doesn't take too long, usually like 5 to 20 minutes, and then if they need to be reversed, all of our medication is reversible. And oftentimes dogs will like wake up with their person next to them, which is often nice. That's kind of how that goes. But yeah, we really care about safety a lot with that. And we're, very careful with dogs who have, more anxious or, more anxiety or more fear.
Yeah, we've done special things in the past, like we can work with dogs attending vets to have pre-meds on board, if a dog's anxious so that they can come with a sedative already. We've had dogs that have like aversions to slippery floors, so we've like put down special floor coverings so that the dog doesn't have to experience a slippery floor. Yeah, we work with people to try to make sure that the dog is comfortable. Um, yeah, we want dogs to be happy. Uh, Okay, so next question, were your dogs from sport pedigree only or subgroup pedigree defined in some way?
Oh yeah. Because this is kind of like a preliminary study, these were just any dogs I could get. So these are all dogs whose uh parents and grandparents were bred for this sport, protection sports, and then they also perform protection sports for at least half a year, if not longer. in most cases longer. And in the future, I think it would be really cool to kind of look at particular bloodlines or particular broad lineages, because there might be interesting differences there. But first, kind of the first task for this sort of research is just to show that their brains are interesting to begin with, and that they, differ from others according to the sort of tasks that they're bred to perform.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Next one. Let's see. Um, I think we may have answered all of the questions. Let's see. Somebody's asking, they have a 5-year-old working line German Shepherd that began in IPO. Would they be good or poor candidate for this type of work since they have hybrid experience history between protection and detection? So it sounds like they started work and then
Mm.
didn't continue.
Okay, and if they have hybrid experience with detection and protection, that wouldn't be ideal either. So probably wouldn't be an ideal candidate, unfortunately, just because we kind of need to have that clearer distinction for the comparison.
Yeah. Let's see. Let's see. Somebody had a question about differences between primitive village dogs and how they may differ between highly cultivated breeds like German Shepherds.
Oh yeah. Well, I have a slide for this. Haha.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah. We published a study on this recently. Which is kind of touching on this. So we were looking at modern breeds like German Shepherds that were created after the during and after the Victorian era. They're recent creations that have been under extremely intense selection for both behavior and appearance. And then they're in blue on this plot. And then in red are these kind of so-called primitive or ancient breed or village dogs also are in this group. These are all what I'm calling pre-modern dogs, which are dogs that have undergone less artificial selection. So the ancient breeds are kind of like intermediate between the village dogs and the modern breed dogs. They've experienced some utilitarian selection, but then they've mostly been selected to preserve ancestral traits since then. And then the village dogs are basically dogs that live as free-ranging individuals that breed freely all over the world outside of the West. And a lot of them on continents are actually indigenous and were never breeds. They have no breed ancestry. They're basically like, what original dogs would have been like. They are in red here. And what we see is that they have bigger regions on this plot. The color is how big the kind of the mass of tissue is. And this is gray matter. So we're talking about, if you know your neuroscience, the cell bodies of the neurons, and the supporting cells around them. And you can see that the amygdala is expanded in the pre-modern dogs compared to the modern dogs, where actually the cortex, the wrinkly outer layer of the brain, is expanded. And the amount of that expansion has to do with how trainable they are. And then I don't have the plot here, but it also relates to how big their fear relates to how big their amygdala is. And so what we kind of see here is that there's this general trend across these broad types of dogs with German Shepherds and the modern breeds, that there has been an increase in brain size over time, and in particular, increase in cortex in those dogs and increase in subcortical regions in the primitive or pre-modern dogs. So that's kind of where we're at there on terms of the gray matter morphology of German Shepherds. We know they're following this pattern.
Yeah, I think these are really exciting results.
Yeah.
Couple of questions about qualification for the study. So one question was, what are the qualification requirements for companion dogs? Are we looking for certain age groups? And then another question was, would dogs that had to retire early due to health but still showed drive and had no desire and changes to work, would they be good candidates?
Okay. So I think to answer sorry, the first question was of the
Companion
requirements.
dogs.
So one thing is that they have to be between the ages of 1 to 9. They can be slightly younger than 1 sometimes, but really we won't go older than 9 for safety reasons. And so that's kind of a requirement, for companion and for the working dogs. And for the companion dogs, it is totally okay if the dog had the drive and, basically had the full potential to perform the work, but for whatever reason didn't, except if that reason is they have a major health issue. So if they have a major health issue that would pose risk for anesthesia, then we're not going to include them in the study for safety reasons. But for instance, where is she? Trinity here. I don't know if you can see it in her paw. I think it's this paw. But she has a little bit of a deformity in that paw, so she couldn't be used as a working dog. But she was a great candidate for this study.
Yeah, okay, let's see. I'm just reading some questions. So how are we able to tease out the impact of specialized breeding versus specialized training on differences in brain structure? Like, could we test dogs that were from a protection lineage but have been trained to do guide work or vice versa? Wow, that would be amazing.
Yeah, that would be super, super cool. I mean, so like with my study, and I think I wanted to mention this, so thank you for your question. I wanted to say that what we've really so we've, started collecting data and we have, a solid number of protection dogs. We still need some more. And we have guide dogs as well, but what we're really lacking are those non-working control dogs. So those dogs that are from protection lines but just aren't working for whatever reason. And so for those, we are, kind of open to like any dogs that like kind of fit the sort of requirements. And then one thing I just want to say also is that ideally those dogs should have little experience in other sports as well, just because um, any sort of activity is going to change their brain somewhat, and it will kind of confuse the analysis if they're involved in like a bunch of other things. So that's just one thing to say. But yeah, but what I was also trying to say there was that with those control dogs, we'll be able to look at what exactly is plasticity. So what is actually different between dogs from the same sorts of lineages who either experience or don't experience the training environment. And then also comparing between breeds, the non-working controls, we can see what is innately there in the dogs that differs between dogs selected for different tasks. So that's kind of how that's how I'm going to kind of tease apart some of that nature and nurture stuff that hasn't quite been teased out with the brain stuff to date, because we've just been able to compare the guide and protection dogs.
Let's see. Next question. Do we think that these different brain structures were present from birth or changed as they grew up?
Oh, yeah. So that kind of goes to like that last question. We don't know yet whether it's one versus the other. I think that it's fair enough to think that there might be some innate differences due to genes, because for instance, the guide dogs in our population have been selectively bred for this for many generations, and then isolated pool. So, just because they're isolated, there's going to be some genetic change, and maybe some trait changes. And then also with the selection, you'll have further change. So it would be reasonable to expect that there are some differences at birth, but they probably also require a lot of experience to fully show the proper, trait, and that would, equate to good performance. So, it's one study that actually Dr. Hecht Aaron here did was she looked at companion dogs and compared their brains across breed groups to see if historical selection trends, if they changed the brains of those dogs. And it turns out that they did, even though those dogs were never involved in those tasks. So we do know that there are kind of innate breed differences in the brains of dogs. We're just kind of trying to nail them down through our imaging now.
Let's see. So let's see. Somebody asked, have we been able to see brain differences between the working line dogs who are good at protection work versus those that aren't, who have all received training? So we did collect some measures of skill or amount of training, but we just haven't looked at that particularly yet, right?
Yeah, we haven't looked at that yet, but because we haven't, got the full sample yet, and I think we'll need a larger sample for it. But yeah, I think it's going to be a really exciting thing that we're going to look at. So, stay tuned for that.
Yeah. Let's see. And then another person asked, their dog is 3 years old and has EPI. Is she a good candidate? I'm not sure what EPI is, unfortunately.
I am not a vet, so I do not know, and I'm not a German Shepherd aficionado necessarily, so
Yeah.
let me just look it up. Uh oh, it's an autoimmune disease, so I don't, it maybe,
Yeah, I would say, Lucia, you could get in touch with us and we can have our veterinarian consult with your veterinarian. And as long as MRI and anesthesia does not pose a health risk for your dog's condition, and as long as your veterinarian agrees with that, then there's no reason, that this wouldn't be that, as long as your veterinarian agrees it's okay, then it's okay with us. Um, so yeah, if you're interested, please get in touch.
yeah,
Well, it's nearly 9:30, so I think maybe
yeah,
we should let people go to bed.
yep.
But it's been so great to see so much interest and so many good questions. And Sophie, you did a great job presenting all this information.
Nice. Yeah, well, thank you so much for everyone for coming and for, listening to me talk. And yeah, just, keep in touch with us on caninebrains.org. I don't have our social media on here, but we have our Instagram at canine_brains. And then we also have a Facebook page, Canine Brains. So you can keep up with us through those methods. And yeah, well, thank you everyone. This was really awesome.
All right.
All right, bye.
Bye, everyone.